Hey guys, tonight the journey leads into the hidden corners of ancient Egypt, where beyond the pharaohs and pyramids, beyond the priests and scribes, existed a world of occupations so unusual, so specialised, and sometimes so bizarre that they challenge modern understanding of work itself. From the sacred to the profane, from the revered to the reviled, these jobs reveal a civilization far more complex and strange than the monuments suggest. Before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if there's genuine interest in what unfolds here. And let everyone know in the comments where the viewing is happening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and ease into tonight's journey together. When modern minds conjure ancient Egypt, certain images tend to surface. Golden death masks gleaming in torchlight, massive stone blocks being hauled toward the sky, hieroglyphs covering temple walls in endless procession. These visions carry truth, certainly, but they represent only the most visible layer of a civilization whose true complexity lay in the countless specialized roles that made Egyptian society function. The Egyptian economy was not the simple agricultural system sometimes imagined, with peasants farming and pharaohs ruling. Instead, it was a remarkably sophisticated network of specialized professions, many of which required years of training, possessed their own technical vocabularies, and carried social meanings that extended far beyond mere economic function. Every aspect of life, from birth to death, and even beyond death, had specialists devoted to managing it. This specialization reached levels that might seem excessive to contemporary understanding. Where modern society might have a single profession covering broad territory, ancient Egypt often divided that territory into multiple distinct occupations, each with its own practitioners, traditions, and social position. The result was a professional landscape of astonishing diversity and sometimes startling strangeness. Understanding these occupations reveals Egyptian values in ways that studying kings and temples alone cannot. What a society considers worthy of professional specialization indicates what it values, fears, or considers essential. The existence of particular jobs shows what Egyptians thought needed doing, and the status attached to different occupations reveals hierarchies of value and meaning. Some Egyptian jobs will seem comprehensible to modern sensibilities, albeit performed under very different conditions. Others will seem peculiar but understandable, given Egyptian religious beliefs and social structures. Still others will appear genuinely bizarre, occupations that served purposes no longer relevant, or that reflected worldviews so different from contemporary understanding that explaining their logic requires substantial cultural translation. The sources for understanding Egyptian occupations are varied and uneven. Tomb paintings and reliefs depict workers engaged in various activities, providing visual evidence of techniques and tools. Administrative texts record the allocation of workers to different tasks and sometimes detail their responsibilities. Literary texts occasionally mention specific professions, though usually in passing. Archaeological evidence reveals workshops, tools, and workspaces that illuminate how particular jobs were performed, yet significant gaps remain. Many occupations, particularly those associated with ritual impurity or low social status, appear rarely in the decorated tombs where much evidence originates. The literate scribes who produced most surviving texts naturally emphasized their own profession, while mentioning others only when administratively necessary. Women's work appears less frequently than men's, though women certainly worked in numerous capacities. The result is an incomplete picture, particularly rich in some areas and frustratingly sparse in others. The hierarchy of Egyptian professions was steep and consequential. At the apex stood positions connected to the pharaoh, the divine king whose very existence maintained cosmic order. Scribes occupied privileged positions as literate elite who managed the written documents essential to administration. Priests wielded religious authority and economic power through temple institutions. Below these elevated positions spread a vast array of craftsmen, farmers, labourers, and specialists, whose work was essential, but whose social status varied considerably. Gender shaped occupational possibilities significantly. While women could and did work in various capacities, certain professions were exclusively or predominantly male, while others were female-dominated. The division didn't always follow patterns modern societies might expect, with some surprisingly elevated roles available to women, and some mundane tasks rigidly gender-restricted. Tonight's exploration focuses on the unusual, the unexpected, and the genuinely strange among Egyptian occupations. This isn't a comprehensive survey of all Egyptian jobs, but rather a journey through those professions that most clearly reveal how different ancient Egyptian society was from contemporary experience. The jobs examined range across social classes, from roles connected to the highest religious rituals to work considered deeply polluting, from occupations requiring years of training to positions filled by the desperate or enslaved. The journey begins not with the most bizarre occupations, but with the sacred, examining roles connected to religious ritual and the afterlife. From there, the path leads through palace and domestic service, then to specialized craftsmen whose skills seem almost magical, continuing through entertainment and appearance-related professions, and finally descending to the occupations Egyptians themselves considered lowest and most undesirable. Along the way, the goal is not merely to catalogue strange jobs, but to understand what their existence reveals about Egyptian society, values, and worldview. So settle in, perhaps with appreciation for the relative simplicity of modern job descriptions, and prepare to discover the professional landscape of ancient Egypt. The strange, the sacred, and the surprising await exploration, revealing a civilization that divided human activity into categories modern minds might never imagine. The Egyptian religious system employed vast numbers of people in roles ranging from the elevated and powerful to the specialized and peculiar. Understanding these positions requires first grasping how differently ancient Egyptians conceived of divine service compared to modern religious traditions. Egyptian temples were not primarily places of congregational worship, but rather machines for maintaining cosmic order through precise ritual performance. Every action had to be executed correctly, at the right time, in the proper manner, or the consequences could be catastrophic. The highest priestly positions carried enormous prestige and power. The high priest of Amun at Karnak, particularly during the New Kingdom when Amun's cult dominated Egyptian religion, wielded influence rivaling the pharaoh himself. These positions controlled vast temple estates, managed thousands of workers, and possessed wealth that made their holders among the richest individuals in Egypt. Yet even these exalted positions involved ritual duties that modern sensibilities might find strange. The daily service of the gods followed rigid patterns established by tradition and maintained through meticulous performance. Each morning, the chief priest performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual designed to animate the god's statue and allow the divine presence to inhabit it. This involved touching various implements to the statue's mouth, eyes, and other body parts, while reciting specific formulas. Only after this ritual could the god be fed, clothed, and otherwise attended. The feeding of the gods required its own cadre of specialists. Food offerings had to be prepared according to exact specifications, presented at prescribed times, and arranged in proper order. These offerings included bread, beer, meat, vegetables, and fruits, all of which had to meet purity standards and be ritually acceptable. After presentation to the god, who was understood to consume the spiritual essence of the food, the physical remains were distributed according to strict hierarchies among temple personnel. This reversion of offerings, called the return from the altar, created a secondary economy within temple complexes. The right to receive particular portions of offerings constituted valuable property that could be inherited, sold, or donated. Some priestly positions existed primarily to manage these distributions, ensuring that everyone received their proper share according to rank and entitlement. Purity requirements for priests varied by role and level, but could be extensive and demanding. Priests serving in the inner sanctum had to maintain ritual cleanliness through frequent washing, shaving of all body hair, wearing only linen clothing, and avoiding certain foods. They couldn't wear wool or leather in sacred spaces as these materials came from animals. They washed multiple times daily in the sacred lake that every major temple maintained for purification purposes. The scheduling of priestly service followed a rotating system called philae, where priests served for a month at a time, then returned to normal life for 3 months before their next service period. This meant that many priests were part-time religious functionaries who held other jobs when not serving in the temple. A man might be a priest one month and a farmer or craftsman the next, moving between sacred and secular roles with apparent ease. Certain priestly roles were highly specialized and decidedly peculiar. The hour priests maintained the temple calendar, tracking the movements of stars and calculating the proper times for rituals. This required astronomical knowledge and mathematical skill. Their work was essential because performing rituals at the wrong time could invalidate them entirely. These priests watched the night sky, measured time using water clocks and sun shadows, and ensured that the cosmic machinery ran on schedule. The lector priests, called Keriheb in Egyptian, were the ritual specialists who recited the magical spells and formulas necessary for ceremonies. They carried papyrus scrolls containing the precise words that had to be spoken for rituals to work. These priests needed to be literate, which already set them apart, and had to memorize complex ritual texts. Their voices, speaking the ancient words correctly, were considered essential to ritual efficacy. Some temples employed dream interpreters, who analysed and explained dreams for petitioners seeking divine guidance. Dreams were understood as communications from the gods, but their meanings weren't always obvious. These specialists maintained reference texts listing standard dream symbols and their interpretations. The famous dream book surviving from ancient Egypt shows the complexity of this interpretive system, with different symbols having different meanings depending on various factors. Temple musicians formed another specialized category. Music accompanied many rituals, and specific instruments were associated with particular gods. The sistrum, a kind of rattle, was especially connected to Hathor, goddess of music, dance, and joy. Women often served as temple musicians, shaking sistrums, singing hymns, and dancing in religious processions. These positions combined artistic skill with religious function, and some women achieved considerable status through musical service to the gods. The god's wife, a position that evolved over Egyptian history, represented one of the strangest priestly roles. In the New Kingdom and later periods, the god's wife of Amun was an extremely powerful position, held by royal princesses who remained celibate and wielded significant political and economic authority. They performed rituals that, in theory, sexually satisfied the god, maintaining his favour and ensuring his continued blessing of Egypt. These women controlled vast estates, commanded their own staffs, and in some periods exercised power comparable to that of pharaohs. Temple servants called Pure Ones or Purifiers maintained the sacred spaces, cleaned ritual implements, and prepared materials for ceremonies. Their work was essential but mundane, washing floors, polishing objects, arranging furniture, and ensuring that everything was ready when priests needed it. Despite the humble nature of these tasks, those who performed them within temple precincts held positions clearly distinguished from ordinary labourers outside. Animal care within temples constituted another area of specialization. Many temples housed sacred animals, from the thousands of ibises at Thoth's temple to the single, carefully selected bull that served as the apis at Memphis. The caretakers of these creatures had to maintain strict purity standards while ensuring the animal's health and comfort. When sacred animals died, they were mummified and buried with ceremony, creating additional work for specialized embalmers and burial priests. The Apis bull cult demonstrates the complexity and strangeness of these arrangements. The Apis was believed to be a living manifestation of the god Ptah, chosen through specific physical markings that identified it as divine. The bull lived in luxury at Memphis, attended by priests who catered to its every need. When it died, the entire nation mourned, and the search began for its successor. The deceased bull was mummified using techniques normally reserved for humans and buried in an enormous underground complex, the Serapeum, in a sarcophagus weighing many tons. The priest responsible for the Apis bull's care had an unusual job by any standard, maintaining essentially a divine pet whose comfort and well-being were matters of national importance. They had to interpret the bull's behaviour as oracular messages as people came to consult the Apis about their futures. The bull's movements, the direction it walked, whether it accepted offered food, all these were read as divine communications requiring priestly interpretation. Oracles were delivered through various means beyond animal behaviour. Some temples had procedures where questions were submitted in writing, and the god's statue would indicate answers through movement, managed by priests hidden behind screens or using mechanical devices. The logistics of operating these oracles while maintaining the illusion of divine agency required considerable organisation and discretion. While believers genuinely thought the god was answering, someone had to manage the practical mechanics. The Sem priests officiated at funerals and performed the opening of the mouth ceremony for the deceased. They wore distinctive clothing, including leopard skins, which set them apart visually and symbolically. Their work involved preparing bodies for burial, performing rituals to restore the deceased's senses in the afterlife, and ensuring proper transition from life to death. This placed them at the boundary between living and dead, between this world and the next, a liminal position carrying both power and danger. Curse writers, or rather those who inscribed protective spells on tomb walls and in coffins, formed another specialised category. These texts were meant to protect the deceased from various dangers in the afterlife while cursing anyone who might disturb the tomb. The inscribers had to know the proper formulas, write them without error, and place them in correct locations. A mistake could render the protection ineffective, leaving the deceased vulnerable to spiritual dangers. The economic importance of temple employment cannot be overstated. Temples were major economic institutions, owning vast agricultural lands, operating workshops, controlling trade routes, and employing thousands. Many of the jobs discussed were paid positions, often quite well remunerated, particularly the higher priestly roles. Even relatively humble temple positions provided economic security and social status beyond what the same work would convey in secular contexts. The relationship between priesthood and political power was complex and shifting. At times, priestly hierarchies operated relatively independently, checking pharaonic power. At other times, pharaohs controlled temple appointments and used religious institutions as administrative arms of the state. The most powerful priesthoods, particularly of Amun, could become so influential that they threatened royal authority, leading to conflicts that occasionally reshaped Egyptian politics. Women's roles in religious service were more extensive than in many later religious traditions, but still limited compared to men's opportunities. Women served as musicians, singers, and dancers in temple service. They could hold priesthoods of certain goddesses. The god's wife of Amun, as mentioned, wielded enormous power in certain periods. Yet women were generally excluded from the highest levels of most priesthoods, and from rituals in the innermost sanctuaries. The training for priestly positions varied by role, but could be extensive. Lector priests needed literacy and memorization skills acquired through years of scribal training. Astronomical priests required mathematical and observational training. Even relatively humble positions needed familiarity with complex purity regulations and ritual procedures. Some positions were hereditary, passed from father to son, with training occurring within families. Others were appointed based on merit or political considerations. The psychological reality of performing these strange rituals daily is difficult to access through ancient sources. Did priests believe literally in the procedures they performed, or did they understand them as symbolic? The question may be anachronistic, as ancient religious psychology didn't necessarily divide literal and symbolic, the way modern thinking does. The rituals worked, from an Egyptian perspective, regardless of what participants privately thought about their mechanisms. The sacred service sector of Egyptian employment reveals a society where the boundary between religious and secular wasn't sharply drawn. Many priests served part-time and held other occupations. Temple activities had enormous economic and political dimensions. The strange and specialised jobs serving the gods represented not separate religious sphere, but integral parts of how Egyptian society organised itself and understood the world. If religious service provided some strange occupations, the Egyptian obsession with death and the afterlife created an entire professional sector devoted to managing mortality. The elaborate preparations for death, the complex preservation of bodies, and the extensive rituals accompanying burial generated numerous specialised jobs, some requiring extraordinary skill and others involving work that Egyptians themselves considered deeply unpleasant despite its necessity. Embalmers occupied a central position in death-related professions. The preservation of the body was essential to Egyptian afterlife beliefs, as the deceased needed their physical form intact to exist in the afterworld. The process of mummification was complex, lengthy, and performed by specialists whose knowledge was technical, ritual, and practical all at once. The chief embalmer, sometimes wearing a jackal mask representing the god Anubis, supervised the mummification process and performed the most crucial steps. Beneath this figure worked various assistants with specific responsibilities. The preservation of elite bodies could take 70 days and required coordination among multiple specialists, each contributing particular expertise to the overall process. The actual steps of mummification were invasive, and to modern sensibilities quite disturbing. One specialist's job was to remove the internal organs through incisions in the body's left side. Another extracted the brain through the nose using long metal hooks, a delicate and unpleasant procedure that required destroying the brain tissue and pulling it out in pieces. These roles involved direct contact with dead flesh, bodily fluids, and internal organs, making them ritually impure and socially problematic despite their importance. After removal, organs were separately preserved and placed in canopic jars, each under the protection of a specific deity. The specialists who prepared these jars and ensured proper assignment of organs to correct containers had to know which god protected which organ, and how to properly invoke that protection. This combined medical knowledge about anatomy with religious knowledge about divine associations. The body cavity, once emptied, had to be dried using natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture. Workers whose job was packing and monitoring the natron had to ensure complete desiccation without damaging the skin. This required judgment about how much natron to use, how often to replace it, and when the drying process was complete. Too little drying and the body would decay, too much, and the skin might become brittle and damaged. After drying came wrapping, a process requiring its own specialists. The body had to be wrapped in specific patterns using linen strips, with amulets and protective charms placed at particular locations according to religious prescriptions. The wrapping wasn't merely functional, but ritual, with prayers recited at each stage. The specialists doing this work needed knowledge of both technique and religious formulas, combining the skills of craftsmen and priests. Some mummies were equipped with elaborate cartonnage masks and coffins decorated with religious scenes and texts. The artisans who created these items formed a specialized subset of artists, skilled in traditional religious iconography and knowledgeable about the spells and images appropriate for funerary contexts. Their work required both artistic talent and religious learning. Professional mourners constituted another distinctive occupation. Egyptian funerals included dramatic displays of grief, with women wailing, tearing their clothing, and throwing dust on their heads. While family members certainly grieved genuinely, professional mourners were hired to augment the demonstration of a loss. These women, usually of lower social status, made their living through performing grief at strangers' funerals. The intensity of the mourning display reflected the deceased's importance and the family's resources. Wealthy funerals included many professional mourners, creating impressive spectacles of collective sorrow. The mourners knew traditional laments and gestures, performing grief according to cultural scripts that made it socially legible and ritually appropriate. This professionalization of grief might seem strange to modern sensibilities, but it reflected Egyptian values about properly honouring the dead. Tomb builders and decorators formed a large occupational category with internal specialization. The construction of rock-cut tombs in places like the Valley of the Kings required skilled stoneworkers who could quarry chambers deep into cliff faces. These workers, particularly those employed on royal tombs, lived in specialized communities like Deir el-Medina, where generations of families devoted themselves to preparing eternal resting places for pharaohs and nobles. The decoration of tombs required artists skilled in the canonical Egyptian style. The scenes on tomb walls weren't merely decorative but served religious and magical purposes, providing the deceased with servants, food and activities in the afterlife. Artists had to know the proper proportions for human figures, the correct colours for different elements, and the traditional scenes appropriate for tombs. They worked from pattern books and followed conventions established over centuries. Hieroglyphic inscribers formed a subset of tomb decorators, responsible for the texts covering walls and coffins. These needed to be both literate and artistically skilled, able to carve or paint hieroglyphs precisely according to established forms. Mistakes in these texts could be spiritually dangerous, potentially denying the deceased access to afterlife privileges or leaving them vulnerable to dangers in the netherworld. The workers who transported mummies and grave goods to tombs had their own organisational structures. The journey from embalmers' workshops to burial sites, sometimes across the Nile and up into desert valleys, required coordination and manpower. The procession accompanying an important burial could include dozens or hundreds of people, all needing to know their roles and positions in the ceremonial movement. Grave goods production generated extensive employment. The items buried with the deceased ranged from simple pottery to elaborate jewellery, furniture and boats. Craftsmen producing these items often worked specifically for the funerary market, creating objects intended never to be used by the living. Some items were purely symbolic, models representing things rather than functional objects, which required understanding what constituted acceptable representation versus what needed to be actual functional items. The creators of Shabti figures, small statuettes meant to serve as magical servants for the deceased in the afterlife, formed one such specialised craft. These figures, sometimes numbering in the hundreds for a single burial, had to be manufactured in quantity while maintaining quality and proper inscriptions. Workshops devoted to Shabti production operated throughout Egyptian history, with styles evolving but the basic concept remaining constant. Tomb robbing, while illegal and condemned, was also effectively a profession in ancient Egypt, practiced across all periods, including ancient times itself. Professional tomb robbers had specialist knowledge of where tombs were located, how to break into them, and which items were most valuable. Some robbers were actually the same workers who built or guarded the tombs, using their inside knowledge for illicit purposes. The records of tomb robbery trials from the 20th dynasty provide fascinating details about how these operations worked. Gangs of robbers worked together, dividing labour and proceeds. Some specialised in breaking through rock and plaster seals, others could assess jewellery and precious metals, still others had connections to markets where stolen grave goods could be sold. The profession was dangerous but potentially lucrative enough that people risked severe punishment, including death if caught. On the legitimate side, tomb guards were employed to protect burial sites from robbers. These positions were sometimes hereditary, with families maintaining guardianship over particular necropolis areas for generations. The work involved living in the desert near tombs, a lonely and uncomfortable existence, but one that provided steady employment and sometimes opportunities for sanctioned access to tomb contents for maintenance purposes. Necropolis administrators managed the complex logistics of burial grounds. They allocated tomb sites, licensed embalmers and craftsmen, collected fees for various services, and maintained records of who was buried where. These administrative positions required literacy and organisational skills, placing their holders among the lower ranks of the educated elite. The mortuary priests who performed regular offerings at tombs after burial constituted another occupational category. These positions were sometimes endowed by the deceased, who set aside property or income to pay for perpetual offerings. The priests would recite prayers and present offerings at the tomb, maintaining the deceased's cult long after death. Some of these positions were inherited, creating family lineages devoted to serving particular deceased individuals or families. The economic scale of the death industry in ancient Egypt was substantial. A significant portion of economic production went toward funerary purposes, from the pyramids representing national projects to the modest tomb equipment of common people. This created employment for thousands and generated wealth for those skilled in death-related services. The social status of death professionals varied considerably. Embalmers, despite performing essential services, dealt with corpses and bodily pollution, which lowered their status despite the importance of their work. Artists and craftsmen producing funerary items held respectable positions. Priests performing funeral rituals occupied higher status, particularly those serving at important tombs or temples. Professional mourners worked at the low end of the status spectrum, selling emotional labour that was necessary but not prestigious. The psychology of working with death daily is another question worth considering. Did embalmers become desensitised to handling corpses? Did tomb builders think about their own mortality while preparing tombs for others? Did professional mourners experience emotional exhaustion from performing grief repeatedly? The sources don't address these personal dimensions, but the human reality behind the professional roles surely involves some psychological adaptation to unusual working conditions. The death industry reveals Egyptian values about mortality, afterlife, and the relationship between living and dead. The enormous investment in preserving bodies and equipping tombs reflected genuine belief that these preparations mattered for eternal existence. The variety and specialization of death-related occupations showed how central mortality was to Egyptian culture. Death wasn't simply the end of life, but a transition requiring extensive professional management. Beyond the sacred and funerary realms, ancient Egypt employed vast numbers in service roles ranging from attendants on pharaohs to household maintenance for the wealthy. Some of these positions were prestigious, placing servants in proximity to power and possibly enabling social advancement. Others were humble and unremarkable. Still others involved duties so specialised and peculiar that they reveal the elaborate nature of elite Egyptian life. The royal household employed hundreds or thousands of people in roles covering every conceivable need and service. At the top of this hierarchy stood the great officials of the palace, administrators who managed the complex institution of kingship. Below them descended ranks of increasingly specialised servants, many with job titles that seem remarkably specific and sometimes almost comical in their narrow focus. The royal sandal-bearer held a position that sounds trivial, but actually conferred considerable prestige. This official carried the pharaoh's sandals and helped the king put them on, a role that required constant proximity to the ruler. The position's importance derived not from the task itself, but from the access it provided. Many royal sandal-bearers went on to higher administrative positions, using their intimate access to the king as a springboard for advancement. Similarly, the fan-bearer on the right of the king held a title that emphasized physical proximity to power. These officials carried ceremonial fans that provided both cooling and symbolic protection to the pharaoh. The position required trustworthiness, as the fan-bearer stood close enough to potentially harm the king if that had been their intention. Many military commanders and high officials held fan-bearing titles, indicating that the position was honorific as much as functional. The royal hairdresser and cosmetician held positions of surprising importance. The pharaoh's appearance was carefully managed, with wigs, makeup and regalia applied according to specific protocols. The servants responsible for these preparations needed both technical skill and discretion. They saw the ruler in states of undress and vulnerability, which required absolute trustworthiness. Some royal hairdressers achieved notable status, with their tombs recording their service with evident pride. Perfumers and ointment makers served elite households, creating the scented oils and cosmetics that were essential to Egyptian grooming practices. These specialists understood how to extract fragrances from flowers, mix oils with resins and spices, and create products that served both cosmetic and medicinal purposes. The finest perfumers might serve the palace, their creations used by pharaohs and their families. The preparation of kohl, the black eye makeup worn by both men and women, required its own specialists. Kohl was made from grinding various minerals, particularly galena, and mixing them with oils or fats to create a paste that could be applied around the eyes. The process required knowledge of which minerals to use, how to grind them to appropriate fineness, and how to achieve the right consistency. Poorly prepared kohl could irritate eyes or fail to provide the desired cosmetic effect. Wig makers formed another specialised craft. Elite Egyptians commonly wore wigs, both for comfort in the hot climate and as fashion statements. These wigs ranged from relatively simple styles to elaborate constructions requiring considerable skill. The best wigs used human hair, while cheaper versions used plant fibres. Wig makers had to understand hairstyling techniques, know how to treat and dye hair, and create pieces that fit comfortably while looking attractive. The royal bedchamber employed its own staff, responsible for preparing the king's sleeping arrangements and guarding his rest. Some officials held titles like Guardian of the Royal Bedchamber, positions that combined security functions with personal service. The intimate nature of these roles required servants of proven loyalty, often drawn from families with long records of faithful service. Wet nurses for royal children held positions that could elevate entire families. The women who nursed future pharaohs established bonds that could lead to their sons being raised alongside princes, educated together, and eventually appointed to high positions based on these childhood connections. Some women who served as royal wet nurses received substantial rewards and honours, with tombs declaring their service to royal offspring. Dwarfs served in various capacities in elite households, sometimes as personal servants to high officials or even pharaohs. Their distinctive appearance made them memorable and perhaps amusing to ancient Egyptians, though the exact attitudes toward dwarfs is debated among scholars. Some dwarfs achieved significant status, with tombs showing them in positions of responsibility. Others may have been kept primarily as curiosities. The dwarf Seneb, who lived during the Old Kingdom, achieved remarkable success, holding the title Overseer of Palace Dwarfs. while also serving in priestly roles. Entertainment in elite households required various specialists. Musicians played harps, lyres, flutes, and percussion instruments at feasts and gatherings. Dancers performed routines that were both artistic and sometimes erotically charged. Acrobats demonstrated physical skills that amazed audiences. These entertainers ranged in status from respected professionals to enslaved performers, depending on their skill and circumstances. The Keeper of the Royal Toilet might sound like a joke title, but managing sanitation for the palace was serious business. Human waste had to be disposed of safely and discreetly. The servants responsible for these tasks dealt with substances considered polluting, which lowered their social status despite the necessity of their work. Similar positions existed in wealthy private households, where maintaining sanitation required regular attention. Food tasters served the paranoid but practical function of ensuring the king's food wasn't poisoned. These servants ate small portions of dishes prepared for the pharaoh before they were served, essentially volunteering to be the first victims of any poisoning attempts. The position required loyalty bordering on self-sacrifice, and presumably came with generous compensation to balance the risk. Kitchen staff in palaces and elite houses included numerous specialists. Head cooks managed meal preparation and supervised subordinates. Bakers specialised in the many varieties of bread that formed dietary staples. Brewers created the thick, nutritious beer that Egyptians drank daily. Butchers prepared meat. Vegetable preparers handled produce. Each role had its techniques and requirements. Laundry servants maintained the extensive wardrobe that elite Egyptians required. The finest linen garments needed careful washing to avoid damage. Pleating, a distinctive feature of high-quality Egyptian clothing, had to be maintained through careful treatment. The servants who washed, pressed, and stored clothing performed work that was essential but menial, placing them in lower service ranks. Personal body servants attended to intimate needs like bathing, oiling of skin, and dressing. These servants saw their employers naked and vulnerable, requiring trust similar to that demanded of chamber servants. The work combined practical care with ritual elements, as bathing and anointing had religious dimensions as well as hygienic purposes. Doorkeepers controlled access to elite residences, determining who could enter and announcing visitors. These positions required judgment about who merited admission and who should be turned away. A skilled doorkeeper understood social hierarchies well enough to make appropriate decisions without causing offence. The position was humble, but carried some authority derived from controlling access. Chair-bearers transported elite individuals in palanquins and carrying chairs. This was physically demanding work requiring strength and coordination, as carriers had to move in unison to keep the chair stable. The number of bearers indicated the passenger's status, with the most important individuals carried by the largest teams. Some chair-bearers were enslaved people, while others were employed servants. Garden maintenance in the elaborate pleasure gardens of the wealthy required knowledge of horticulture and irrigation. Gardeners cultivated flowers, fruits, and vegetables in carefully designed spaces that provided both food and beauty. They managed the irrigation systems that kept gardens green despite Egypt's desert climate. Some gardeners specialised in particular types of plants, or in the design and layout of gardens. Animal keepers cared for the pets, and exotic creatures that wealthy Egyptians collected. Monkeys, imported from the south, were popular pets among the elite. Dogs and cats lived in households, with cats particularly valued for their ability to control vermin. Birds were kept for both eggs and aesthetic pleasure. The servants responsible for these animals needed appropriate knowledge about feeding and care. The steward or estate manager held the most powerful position among household servants. This official oversaw all domestic operations, managed other servants, handled financial matters, and represented the household in dealings with outsiders. A competent steward was invaluable, running the household so efficiently that the master could focus on other concerns. Many stewards were literate, using their skills to maintain accounts and conduct correspondence. Scribes working for private households tracked property, maintained records, and handled correspondence. These positions offered lower-ranking individuals opportunities to use literacy skills in relatively secure employment. A household scribe might advance to more important positions if they demonstrated competence and earned their employer's trust. The slave economy in ancient Egypt was less central than in some other ancient societies, but still significant. Enslaved people worked in various capacities, from agricultural labour to domestic service. The sources use different terms for different categories of unfree labour, suggesting complex gradations between full slavery and free service. Some enslaved people, particularly those with skills, or those serving in temples or palaces, might live relatively comfortable lives compared to agricultural slaves or war captives. The social distance between masters and servants varied by era and individual circumstances. Some servants in elite households lived quite comfortably, better fed and housed than free farmers or labourers. Others experienced harsh treatment and exploitation. The personal relationship between employer and servant mattered enormously, with kind masters creating very different environments than cruel ones. The potential for advancement through faithful service meant that some individuals entered domestic service voluntarily, hoping to improve their positions over time. A talented servant might be promoted through household ranks, or even be granted freedom if enslaved. Some servants accumulated property through gifts and wages, eventually achieving independence. These possibilities, while not available to all, created incentives for loyal service. Women's domestic work often went unrecorded, as household maintenance performed by wives, daughters, and female servants was considered normal rather than noteworthy. Yet this work was essential. Grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, weaving cloth, caring for children, and countless other tasks that sustained household life. The invisibility of this labour in sources doesn't reflect its actual insignificance, but rather the gender biases of record-keeping. The strange specialization of palace and domestic service reveals how elaborate elite life had become. The existence of positions like sandal-bearer or fan-bearer shows that even the most mundane aspects of daily life were transformed into specialized roles when serving royalty. The proliferation of service positions also demonstrates the wealth concentration that allowed some Egyptians to maintain large household staffs, while most laboured to support themselves and their own families. Ancient Egypt's artistic and craft traditions required specialists whose skills took years to master, and whose knowledge was sometimes closely guarded. These occupations produced the objects that fill museums today, and that shaped Egyptian material culture. Some crafts were respected trades offering good livings, others involved techniques so unusual or materials so challenging that the specialists who mastered them stood apart as possessors of almost magical knowledge. Sculptors who created the massive stone statues of pharaohs and gods worked with some of the hardest materials available: granite, quartzite, and diorite. The techniques for carving these stones using copper tools, sand, and pounding stones required both skill and patience. A single statue might take years to complete, with specialists understanding how stone fractured, where to strike to remove material, and how to achieve smooth surfaces and fine details. The quarrying of stone itself employed thousands. Workers in quarries at Aswan and elsewhere extracted the granite used in major monuments. They understood the stone's grain, knew where to place wooden wedges that would be soaked with water to expand and split the rock, and could shape rough blocks that would later be finished by sculptors. The work was physically demanding and dangerous, with the potential for injury from falling stones or tool accidents. Gold workers created the elaborate jewellery and decorative objects that marked Egyptian wealth and artistry. Working gold required understanding its properties, knowing how to achieve desired purities through refining and mastering techniques like hammering, casting, and granulation. Some goldsmiths specialised in particular techniques or types of objects, while others were generalists capable of producing various items. The creation of gold leaf, hammered so thin it was nearly transparent, required specialised skill. Goldsmiths had to hammer the metal progressively thinner without tearing it, a process requiring both strength and delicate control. Gold leaf covered wooden objects to create the illusion of solid gold at a fraction of the cost and weight. The technique allowed more widespread use of gold in decoration. Jewellers who worked with semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise needed to source materials, many of which came from distant locations through trade. They had to cut and polish stones, drill holes for stringing, and set stones in metal settings. The elaborate collar necklaces and pectorals found in royal tombs demonstrate remarkable technical skill in combining metals and stones into complex designs. Glassmakers possessed knowledge that seemed almost alchemical to those unfamiliar with their craft. the ability to transform sand, natron and other materials into colourful glass through heat, was impressive and somewhat mysterious. Egyptian glass was typically opaque and brightly coloured, used for beads, small vessels and inlays rather than the clear glass developed later by other cultures. The creation of Egyptian blue, the first synthetic pigment, required specialist knowledge. This bright blue colour was produced by heating a mixture of silica, lime, copper and an alkali. The precise recipe and firing conditions had to be controlled carefully to produce the desired colour. Craftsmen who could reliably produce Egyptian blue possessed valuable technical knowledge. Faience workers created the distinctive glazed ceramic material used extensively for amulets, vessels, and decorative objects. Faience production involved shaping a core material, coating it with a glaze mixture, and firing it to produce the characteristic blue-green finish. Different finishing techniques created variations in appearance and quality. The craft required understanding both the core material and glaze chemistry, at least in practical terms, if not theoretical understanding. Potters formed one of the largest craft groups, producing the ceramic vessels used for storage, cooking, and serving throughout Egypt. While pottery might seem straightforward, skilled potters controlled their materials carefully, understanding how different clays behaved, how to achieve thin walls without structural failure, and how to decorate surfaces. Some potters specialised in fine wares for elite consumption, while others produced utilitarian vessels in large quantities. The development of the potter's wheel represented a significant technological advance, allowing faster production and more symmetrical forms. Potters who mastered wheel throwing could produce standardised vessels efficiently, meeting the large-scale demand for ceramic containers. Yet handmade pottery continued alongside wheel-thrown wares, with some forms better suited to hand production. Leather workers transformed animal hides into useful products ranging from sandals to military equipment. The preparation of leather required removing hair, treating hides to prevent decay, and softening the material so it could be worked. Different animals provided hides with different properties, with cattle providing the sturdiest leather, while goat and sheep offered softer materials suitable for different applications. Sandal makers specialised in the ubiquitous footwear worn by Egyptians who could afford them. Sandals were typically made from papyrus or leather, woven or cut in designs that provided protection, while allowing feet to breathe in the hot climate. The styles varied by status and fashion, with simple, commoner sandals contrasting sharply with the elaborate footwear of the elite. Rope makers created an essential product using fibres from various plants, particularly papyrus and palm. Rope served countless purposes in construction, shipping, agriculture, and daily life. The production of strong, durable rope required selecting appropriate fibres, treating them properly and twisting them with correct tension. Different rope types suited different purposes, with weight-bearing applications requiring sturdier construction than binding uses. Basket weavers used similar plant materials to create containers, mats, and architectural elements. The technique required dexterity and understanding of how materials behaved when wetted and dried. Different weaving patterns created objects with different properties. Tight weaves for containers holding small items, looser weaves for winnowing baskets, decorative patterns for high-quality pieces. Papyrus makers possessed specialised knowledge valuable to the literate elite and administrative apparatus that depended on writing materials. The production of papyrus sheets involved cutting papyrus stalks into strips, laying them in perpendicular layers, pounding them together, and pressing them into thin sheets suitable for writing. The quality of papyrus varied, with fine grades commanding high prices for important documents. Scribes, while not craftsmen in the usual sense, developed their writing skills through long apprenticeship and practice. The mastery of hieroglyphics, hieratic script, and later demotic required memorizing hundreds of signs and understanding complex grammatical rules. Scribes held elevated social positions, as literacy opened doors to administrative careers unavailable to the illiterate majority. The creation of writing materials extended beyond papyrus to include brushmaking and ink production. Scribes' brushes were made from rushes, cut and chewed to create brush tips. Ink was produced by mixing soot or coloured minerals with water and gum to create black and red inks used in texts. These materials, while seemingly simple, required proper preparation for optimal writing results. Furniture makers crafted the beds, chairs, boxes, and other wooden objects used in Egyptian homes. Fine furniture required both carpentry skills and often decorative inlay work, combining wood with ivory, metal, or stone. The elegant furniture found in elite tombs demonstrates sophisticated understanding of joinery, proportion, and aesthetic principles. Boat builders constructed the vessels that transported people and goods along the Nile, Egypt's primary transportation corridor. Boat building required understanding how wood behaved when wet, how to create watertight seams, and how to design hulls that were stable and manoeuvrable. Different boats served different purposes, from small reed craft for local transport to large wooden vessels for long-distance trade. The construction of the huge solar boats buried near pyramids, like the remarkably preserved boat of Khufu at Giza, required specialized knowledge and significant resources. These ceremonial vessels, designed to transport the pharaoh's spirit in the afterlife, were built with great care and sometimes dismantled for burial. The workers who built them possessed shipbuilding skills of the highest level. Textile workers, predominantly women, transformed flax into the linen that clothed Egyptians and served numerous other purposes. The process began with harvesting flax, retting it to separate fibres, spinning fibres into thread, and finally weaving thread into cloth. Each stage required skill and experience. The finest linen, nearly transparent and incredibly soft, took enormous effort to produce and was correspondingly valuable. Weaving occurred on horizontal or vertical looms, with weavers creating patterns through careful thread control. Plain weave was most common, but skilled weavers could create more complex patterns and textures. The width of fabric was limited by loom width, requiring sewing of multiple pieces for large items like clothing or sails. Dyers transformed white linen into coloured fabrics using various natural dyes. Different plants, insects, and minerals provided different colours, with some dyes being much more expensive than others. Red dyes from madder plants were common. Blue came from indigo or woad. Yellow could be extracted from various flowers. Purple, made from murex shells, was extremely expensive and associated with the highest status. Woodworkers faced challenges in wood-scarce Egypt, where most trees were date palms unsuited for fine carpentry. High-quality woods like cedar and ebony had to be imported from Lebanon and Africa at considerable expense. This made wood craftsmen's skills particularly valuable, as they worked with costly materials that couldn't be wasted through errors. The preservation of craft knowledge occurred through apprenticeship systems, where sons often learned their father's trades. This created craft dynasties where families maintained specific occupational identities across generations. Workshop communities like Deir el-Medina show concentrations of particular crafts, with specialized knowledge concentrated in specific lineages. Guild-like organizations may have existed for some crafts, though the evidence is unclear. What's certain is that craftsmen were organized for administrative purposes, assigned to projects, allocated rations, and supervised by overseers. The state controlled much craft production, particularly for monumental projects, though private workshops also existed serving non-state markets. The status of craftsmen varied by craft and skill level. Master craftsmen who created works for temples or palaces achieved considerable respect and comfortable livings. Ordinary craftsmen working on routine production held middle positions in the social hierarchy, neither elevated nor despised. The work was skilled but manual, placing craftsmen above labourers but below the literate elite. Some crafts were hereditary in practice, if not law, with sons expected to follow fathers into trades. Other crafts were more open, with talented individuals able to learn regardless of family background. Apprentices started young, spending years mastering techniques before achieving full competence. The best craftsmen might eventually supervise others, translating technical skill into managerial authority. The strange specialized knowledge that craftsmen possessed, the secrets of their trades, created boundaries between those who knew and those who didn't. A sculptor knew where to strike stone to split it cleanly. A glassmaker knew proportions that produced particular colours. A perfumer knew which flowers yielded fragrances at which times. This knowledge, accumulated over generations and guarded within craft communities, was valuable intellectual property even if not formally protected as such. The material culture of ancient Egypt that fills museums today is the product of these craftsmen's skills and knowledge. Every statue, jewel, piece of furniture or ceramic vessel represents specialized technical knowledge passed through generations and applied with care by individuals whose names are mostly lost, but whose work survives. Understanding these crafts as occupations, as ways people made their livings and found their places in society, enriches appreciation for both the objects and the civilization that produced them. Beyond the necessities of survival and the demands of religion, ancient Egyptians valued beauty, pleasure, and entertainment. These values created occupations devoted to enhancing appearance, providing amusement, and offering sensory pleasures. Some of these professions were respected, others were socially marginal. All reveal aspects of Egyptian culture sometimes overshadowed by focus on pyramids and pharaohs. Barbers provided essential grooming services to a population that valued hair removal and specific hairstyles. The hot climate made excessive hair uncomfortable, and religious purity requirements often demanded hair removal for priests. Barbers used bronze razors to shave faces, heads, and bodies, a process that was probably somewhat uncomfortable given the tool's sharpness limitations. The work required steady hands and trust, as razors could easily injure clients. Barbershops seem to have existed as gathering places where men socialized while receiving grooming services. Like barbershops in many later cultures, these were spaces for conversation, gossip, and community interaction. The social dimension added value beyond mere hair removal, making barbers facilitators of male social networks, as well as providers of grooming services. Manicurists and pedicurists attended to the hands and feet of wealthy clients. Properly maintained nails were part of elite appearance standards. The servants who provided these services needed some knowledge of hygiene to avoid causing infections while trimming and cleaning nails. The work was intimate and required gentle touch to avoid injuring delicate nail beds. Massage practitioners offered services that were both pleasurable and therapeutic. Egyptian medicine recognized massage as beneficial for various conditions, and professional masseurs developed techniques for treating muscle problems, improving circulation, and simply providing relaxation. The line between medical and pleasure massage was less distinct than in some modern contexts, with overlap between therapeutic and hedonic functions. Bath attendants assisted wealthy clients with bathing rituals that went beyond simple cleanliness. The application of oils and unguents after bathing required knowledge of which products suited different purposes and how to massage them into skin effectively. These servants combined practical service with elements of luxury that transformed routine bathing into indulgent experience. Cosmetics applicators helped wealthy women, and sometimes men, apply the elaborate makeup that was fashionable in elite circles. The application of kohl around eyes required steady hands to achieve attractive results. Face painting involved various coloured pigments applied to create desired effects. Cheek rouge, lip colour, and henna for hands and nails all required proper application by servants skilled in cosmetic techniques. Henna artists specialised in applying the reddish dye to hands, feet, and hair. The application of henna in decorative patterns may have occurred, though the evidence is limited. What's clear is that henna usage was common enough to support specialists who understood how to prepare the dye and apply it for optimal colour and lasting effect. Musicians formed a significant occupational category, with specialisations by instrument. Harpists, flutists, lute players, and percussionists all developed distinct skills. The best musicians might serve in temples or palaces, performing sacred music or entertaining at elite banquets. Lesser musicians played in the streets or taverns, making modest livings from tips and occasional fees. Female musicians appear frequently in tomb art, often depicted playing harps or other instruments at banquets. These women might be professional entertainers, trained slaves, or members of elite families performing as accomplished amateurs. The social status of female musicians is debated, with some scholars seeing respected artistry, while others emphasize potential association with sexual availability. Singers provided vocals for religious ceremonies, celebrations, and entertainment. Solo singers developed impressive vocal abilities, while choral singing in religious contexts required training for ensemble coordination. Song lyrics range from sacred hymns to love poetry to work songs coordinating group labour. The variety of contexts created diverse opportunities for those with musical vocal talents. Dancers performed in various contexts, from religious processions to private entertainments. The movements depicted in tomb paintings suggest dance styles that were energetic and sometimes acrobatic. Female dancers often wore minimal clothing and adopted poses suggesting flexibility and sensuous movement. Whether this dance was primarily sacred, entertaining, or erotically provocative is debated, with different contexts probably supporting different performance styles. Acrobats demonstrated physical capabilities that amazed audiences through tumbling, contortions, and balance feats. These performers trained from young ages to develop necessary flexibility and strength. Acrobatic troupes might include both men and women performing together or separately. The occupation was physically demanding with short career spans, as aging bodies couldn't maintain necessary capabilities. Storytellers and poets entertained through verbal artistry, reciting traditional tales, creating new narratives, and performing poetry. Oral performance was primary entertainment in a largely illiterate society, making skilled storytellers valuable. The best might be attached to elite households or perform at celebrations, while others worked as itinerant entertainers travelling between communities. Conjurers and magicians performed sleight of hand and illusions that entertained audiences while sometimes claiming supernatural powers. The line between entertainment magic and religious ritual magic was fuzzy, with some performers walking both sides. Documentary texts mention magicians being called to Pharaoh's court to perform feats, suggesting respect for exceptional practitioners, even if most were regarded as mere entertainers. Board game makers created sonnet sets and other gaming equipment. Senet, a board game with religious significance, was played across Egyptian society with sets ranging from simple, scratched boards with pebbles as pieces to elaborate inlaid boards with shaped game pieces. Craftsmen who specialised in fine gaming equipment supplied wealthy clients, while cheaper sets served common players. Pet groomers and trainers worked with the animals that wealthy Egyptians kept for pleasure. Monkeys, imported from south of Egypt, were popular pets requiring specialised care. Dog trainers developed hunting dogs for elite sport. Cat appreciation was widespread, though cats were valued more for practical vermin control than as modern-style pets. The servants who cared for these animals needed understanding of animal behaviour and husbandry. Exotic animal handlers worked with more unusual creatures. Pharaohs and wealthy nobles sometimes kept lions, antelope, or other wild animals as status symbols. These dangerous animals required expert handling by individuals who understood animal behaviour and could manage risks. The occupation was obviously hazardous, with constant possibility of injury from unpredictable animals. Sex workers existed in ancient Egypt, as in most societies, though evidence about their lives and working conditions is limited. Some worked independently, others in establishments that might be characterised as brothels. The social status was low, and the work carried stigma, yet it persisted as a way for some women to earn money, sometimes as alternative to worse poverty. The association of certain female musicians and dancers with sexual availability has already been mentioned, suggesting overlap between entertainment and sex work in some contexts. Tavern keepers operated establishments serving beer and food to working-class customers. These taverns were social centres where ordinary Egyptians gathered to drink, eat and socialise. The keepers, often women in earlier periods, provided hospitality while managing sometimes rowdy clientele. The work was profitable but carried some social disapproval, as taverns were seen as potentially disreputable spaces where excessive drinking and questionable behaviour occurred. Beer production itself employed many women, as brewing was traditionally female work in Egypt. The thick, nutritious beer that Egyptians drank daily had to be brewed regularly, as it didn't keep long. Brewsters understood the fermentation process, could judge when beer was ready, and knew how to achieve desired strengths and flavours. Some brewers worked in their own homes for family consumption, while others produced beer commercially. Party planners, though not called that, existed as servants who organised banquets and celebrations for wealthy employers. These individuals had to coordinate food preparation, manage servants, arrange entertainment, and ensure everything flowed smoothly. The successful execution of an impressive banquet required organisational skills and social knowledge about proper protocols and expectations. Flower gatherers supplied the enormous quantities of lotus, papyrus and other flowers used in decorating banquets, making perfumes and creating garlands. The lotus flower held religious significance and aesthetic appeal, appearing constantly in Egyptian art and decoration. The gatherers who harvested these flowers from marshes and pools provided materials essential to elite entertainment and religious ritual. Incense makers created the aromatic substances burned in religious ceremonies and elite homes. Different resins and plant materials produced different scents when burned, and skilled incense makers knew how to blend ingredients for desired effects. Frankincense and myrrh, imported from Arabia and the Horn of Africa, were particularly valued for religious uses. Perfume vendors sold prepared scents in markets and through direct sales to customers. These entrepreneurs needed to understand customer preferences, price products competitively, and source supplies from perfume manufacturers. The work required social skills for sales along with knowledge of products being sold. Athletic trainers prepared young men for the competitive sports and physical activities that were part of elite male culture. Wrestling, stick fighting, and various other physical contests required training and practice. The trainers who developed these skills in students combined knowledge of athletic technique with ability to motivate and instruct. Game referees oversaw sporting contests and resolved disputes about rules and outcomes. Their authority depended on reputation for fairness and knowledge of proper procedures. The position required judgment and sometimes courage to make unpopular calls against powerful individuals. The occupations related to appearance and entertainment reveal a society that valued beauty, pleasure, and leisure beyond mere survival. These jobs served the human desires for attractiveness, amusement, and sensory delight. While some held these occupations in high regard, particularly skilled artists and musicians, others faced social stigma despite providing services that were in demand. The persistence of these professions across Egyptian history testifies to the consistent human desire for beauty and pleasure, regardless of culture or era. Every society has jobs that someone must do, but that nobody particularly wants to claim. Ancient Egypt had its share of such occupations, work that was necessary for society's functioning, but that carried stigma due to ritual pollution, contact with unsavoury materials, or simple social prejudice. Understanding these professions and the people who performed them illuminates Egyptian values from another angle, revealing what Egyptians found repellent or polluting, even while depending on those willing to do this work. Launderers cleaned the clothing and linens of those who could afford their services. The work involved treading garments in water mixed with natron, beating them against stones, and rinsing them repeatedly. The physical labour was demanding, the work was wet and uncomfortable, and the pay was poor. Launderers worked along riverbanks or at designated washing places, often in groups, making their poverty and low status visible to all. The social contempt for launderers appears in Egyptian texts where the profession is used as example of undesirable work. The occupation's status was so low that scribal wisdom texts counselling young men to study hard to avoid manual labour specifically mentioned launderers as cautionary examples of what awaited the uneducated. The contempt seems excessive for work that was simply physically demanding and monotonous, suggesting that other factors, perhaps ritual pollution from handling soiled garments, contributed to negative attitudes. Fuller work, treating cloth to clean and soften it, was closely related to laundering but involved additional chemical processes. Fullers used various substances including urine, which was collected and used for its ammonia content in cleaning and preparing cloth. The work's association with urine made it particularly unpleasant and contributed to low status. Despite the necessity of the service, those who performed it occupied the bottom of the occupational hierarchy. Tanners transformed animal hides into leather through processes that were smelly, polluting, and labour-intensive. The preparation of hides involved scraping away flesh and hair, soaking in various solutions to prevent decay and soften the leather, and treating with tannins from plant materials. The smells were reportedly awful, and tanners worked with dead animal materials that carried ritual pollution. Tanneries were consequently located away from residential areas when possible. The products tanners created were valuable and necessary, yet their makers were despised. This contradiction, where society needed the product, but scorned the producer, created a category of essential outcasts. Tanners might make decent livings from their necessary work, but social respectability remained beyond reach. Butchers slaughtered animals for food and religious sacrifices. While some butchering work connected to temple sacrifices held more respect, the actual killing and processing of animals was bloody, smelly, and associated with death. The ritual impurity of handling dead animals and blood meant that butchers occupied ambiguous social positions, necessary but not respected. The techniques of efficient butchering required considerable knowledge and skill. Knowing where to cut to separate joints, how to remove hides without damaging them, which parts were choice cuts and which were less desirable, all this expertise developed through experience. The best butchers could process animals quickly and efficiently, minimizing waste while producing properly prepared meat for consumption or sacrifice. Fishermen and fish processors worked with another food source that carried some stigma despite its importance in Egyptian diet. Fish was widely eaten, but also subject to various taboos and restrictions. Certain fish were forbidden in some regions or during specific religious periods. The smell of fish processing was powerful, and workers in the industry became associated with that smell. The processing of fish for preservation through drying and salting employed many workers along the Nile and at coastal areas. Fish were gutted, cleaned, and either dried in the sun or packed in salt for storage. The work was messy and odorous, contributing to the low status of those engaged in it, despite the valuable food being preserved. The production of garum and other fermented fish sauces involved allowing fish to decompose in controlled conditions, creating products that were delicious, but produced through processes that were smelly and apparently disgusting to observe. The workers who managed these fermentation facilities endured powerful odours and dealt with decomposing organic matter, work that few would choose if alternatives existed. Scavengers and garbage collectors removed waste from urban areas. In densely populated cities, the accumulation of garbage, human waste and animal remains created health hazards and unpleasantness that had to be managed. The workers who hauled away this refuse dealt with some of the most unpleasant materials imaginable, earning contempt despite providing essential public health services. The disposal of human waste in cities without modern plumbing required systems for removal and disposal. Workers who emptied latrines and hauled away human waste faced material that was both physically disgusting and ritually polluting. The work was necessary but deeply stigmatized, creating a class of workers who were essential but scorned. Corpse bearers who transported bodies to embalmers or burial sites dealt with death in its most physical form. The handling of corpses carried ritual pollution, requiring purification for those who performed such work. While embalmers at least had skilled profession status to partially offset the pollution, those who simply carried bodies had no such compensation. Professional mourners, already mentioned in the funerary context, occupied low social positions despite their essential role in funeral rites. The women who sold their grief, performing emotional labour for hire, faced contempt as much as gratitude. Their poverty, forcing them to work in this capacity, was visible in their performance, creating a kind of public poverty theatre that reinforced their low status. Latrine attendants at public facilities had perhaps the most undignified work imaginable, managing spaces where people relieved themselves and cleaning up afterward. The work was necessary in urban contexts where public facilities served many users, but nobody respected those who did it. The association with human waste was so polluting that workers became permanently marked by their occupation. Snake and scorpion handlers removed dangerous creatures from homes and streets. Egypt's desert environment produced venomous snakes and scorpions that regularly invaded human spaces. The specialists who could capture and remove these creatures provided valuable service, but were often seen with suspicion, as their ability to handle dangerous creatures suggested potentially dangerous magical knowledge. Executioners carried out capital punishments, killing people on behalf of the state. While legally sanctioned, the act of killing humans made executioners ritually impure and socially isolated. The work required emotional callousness or detachment that ordinary people found disturbing. Executioners were necessary for maintaining law, but were kept at social distance by communities that needed their services, but didn't want close association with killers. Tomb robbers, already mentioned as an illegal profession, were despised not just for criminality, but for violating sacred spaces and disturbing the dead. The pollution of entering tombs and handling burial goods compounded the legal and moral wrongness of theft. Caught tomb robbers faced severe punishments, but beyond legal consequences, their work marked them as willing to commit acts that most Egyptians found profoundly wrong on religious and moral grounds. Prison guards oversaw criminals and prisoners, work that brought them into constant contact with the worst members of society. The association with criminals carried some stigma, as did the violence sometimes necessary to control prisoners. Guard work paid better than many low-status jobs, compensating somewhat for the unpleasantness, but social respect remained limited. Prostitutes, already mentioned briefly, definitely occupied low social status despite providing services for which there was apparently steady demand. The women, and sometimes men, who sold sexual services did so usually from poverty and desperation rather than choice. Society simultaneously used and despised them, creating a class of people whose stigma was profound while their services were sought. Lepers and those with disfiguring diseases or disabilities sometimes could only survive by begging. While not exactly an occupation, begging became the only economic option for those whose conditions made other work impossible. Beggars gathered at temple entrances and markets soliciting charity from those more fortunate. The desperation and visible suffering of beggars made others uncomfortable, while the beggars themselves occupied the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. The existence of these low-status occupations reminds us that ancient Egypt, for all its impressive achievements, was a hierarchical society where some people did work that others wouldn't touch, often because they had no alternatives. The pollution concepts that made certain work stigmatized were culturally constructed, but their effects were real for those marked by their occupations. The despised workers were still people, with the same human needs and desires as anyone else. They formed families, had friendships, experienced joy and sorrow. Their low social status didn't make them less human, only less fortunate in the positions they occupied within Egyptian social structure. Understanding their place in society enriches the picture of ancient Egypt beyond monuments and elite culture, revealing the full spectrum of human experience in that civilization. As the sun sets over the Nile Valley, casting golden light across fields where farmers worked, markets where vendors sold, and temples where priests served, the full panorama of Egyptian working life comes into focus. The strange jobs, the specialized roles, the despised occupations alongside the elevated professions, all together they created the complex tapestry of Egyptian economic and social life. The specialization of labour in ancient Egypt was remarkable for a pre-industrial society. Where one might expect relatively undifferentiated work with most people, farming, and a few doing everything else, Egypt instead developed an occupational structure of surprising complexity. This specialization reflected both technological advancement and sophisticated social organization capable of sustaining people in highly specific roles. The sacred occupations, from priests managing daily temple rituals to embalmers preserving bodies for eternity, reveal a society where religious belief shaped economic activity profoundly. The enormous investment in religious infrastructure, funeral preparations and ritual maintenance would seem irrational from purely materialist perspective, but made perfect sense within Egyptian worldview, where cosmic order depended on proper ritual performance, and where life's ultimate goal was successful transition to eternal afterlife. The domestic and palace service roles demonstrate how elaborate elite life had become. The existence of positions like royal sandal bearer or keeper of the perfume oils shows wealth concentration extreme enough to support extensive household staffs performing highly specialized services. This luxury, built on agricultural surplus extracted from farmers and the labour of workers, created employment for some while representing exploitation for others. The skilled craftsmen whose work fills museums demonstrate technical capabilities often underestimated when ancient societies are dismissed as primitive. The metallurgy, stone carving, glassmaking and other specialized crafts required knowledge accumulated over generations and skills requiring years to master. These were not simple people making simple things, but accomplished specialists producing sophisticated objects through complex processes. The entertainment and appearance professions reveal values beyond mere survival. Ancient Egyptians, at least those with resources, valued beauty, pleasure and aesthetic experience. They were willing to pay for music, dance, cosmetic enhancement, and leisure activities, creating employment for those who could provide these services. This suggests a quality of life beyond subsistence for at least some Egyptians. The despised occupations, those involving pollution, unpleasant materials, or simply poverty, remind us that Egyptian society had a bottom as well as a top. Not everyone's life was pleasant or dignified. Some people did work that others wouldn't touch, often because they had no alternatives. The hierarchy was steep, and those at the bottom faced not just poverty, but social contempt for their necessary labour. The gender dimensions of work, with certain occupations male-dominated and others female-dominated, reflect assumptions about appropriate activities for different sexes. Women worked extensively, despite their labour sometimes being invisible in sources. Their work was essential to household function and economic production, even when not formally recognised as occupation. The relationship between occupation and identity was strong in ancient Egypt. What a person did for living substantially defined who they were socially. Occupational identities were often hereditary, with sons following fathers into trades, and sometimes even taking same professional titles. This created stability and continuity, but also limited mobility for those born into low-status work. The strange and specialised nature of many Egyptian occupations reflects a society that categorised activities finely, creating distinct roles for functions that other cultures might combine. Where one society might have general servants, Egypt had specialised positions for specific services. Where another culture might have generic craftsmen, Egypt had specialists in particular materials or techniques. This tendency towards specialisation created efficiency through concentrated expertise, but also created rigidity through fixed occupational categories. The system worked well in stable conditions, but might have struggled to adapt to rapid change. The eventual decline of pharaonic Egypt involved many factors, but the inflexibility of its social and occupational structures may have contributed to inability to adapt to changing circumstances. The economic implications of this occupational structure were substantial. The ability to support large numbers in non-agricultural work indicated productive agriculture capable of generating surplus beyond what farmers themselves needed. The sophisticated administration managing resource allocation, taxation, and labour deployment enabled the whole system to function. When that administration weakened, or when agricultural surplus declined, the entire structure became vulnerable. The comparative perspective shows that Egyptian occupational specialisation was unusual for its time. Contemporary Mesopotamian societies also had specialised labour, but Egyptian specialisation had distinctive characteristics reflecting Egyptian religious beliefs and social values. The emphasis on funerary preparations, the elaborate religious apparatus, the specific social hierarchies, all these gave Egyptian occupational structure its particular character. Modern fascination with ancient Egyptian occupations often focuses on the exotic and strange, but perhaps the most interesting aspect is how recognisable many roles are. Craftsmen, musicians, servants, administrators, these occupational categories exist in most societies. The specific forms they took in Egypt were unique, but the fundamental human activities they performed are universal. The lives behind the occupations, the individual humans who were sandal bearers and embalmers, who sculpted stone and brewed beer, who danced at banquets and cleaned latrines, these lives are mostly lost to history. Occasional tomb biographies preserve names and accomplishments of successful individuals. A few letters and documents record personal details. But most Egyptian workers remain anonymous, known only through what their hands created or what their work made possible. Yet understanding the occupational structure reveals much about the society as a whole. The values that determined which jobs were respected and which despised show what Egyptians thought mattered. The resources devoted to different activities indicate priorities and beliefs. The complexity of specialization demonstrates sophisticated organization and technical capability. The strange jobs of ancient Egypt, from dream interpreters to professional mourners, from Apis bull attendants to tomb curse writers, reveal a civilization simultaneously familiar and alien. The basic human activities, working to earn living, specializing in particular skills, organizing labour to accomplish complex tasks, all these are universal. The specific forms these activities took in Egypt, shaped by unique religious beliefs and cultural values, create the strangeness and fascination. In exploring these occupations, the goal has been not merely to catalogue bizarre jobs, but to understand what their existence reveals about Egyptian society. Every occupation, however strange it might seem from contemporary perspective, served purposes within Egyptian cultural and economic context. Understanding those purposes enriches appreciation for the complexity of this remarkable civilization. As darkness fully falls over the ancient world and the workers of long ago complete their final shifts, disappearing into the mists of history, the knowledge of their labour remains. The monuments they built still stand. The objects they crafted still survive. The economic and social structures they maintained still speak to us across millennia about human capability, creativity, and the endless diversity of ways humans organise themselves and their work. The strangest jobs in ancient Egypt were strange from our perspective, but to those who performed them, they were simply their work, their place in society, their way of earning their living and supporting their families. In understanding both the strangeness and the human reality behind these occupations, we come to appreciate both how different ancient Egypt was from our world, and how much it shared with all human societies. The need for work, the organisation of labour, the hierarchy of status, and the individual humans navigating it all, making their livings in whatever ways circumstance and society provided.